Welcome back to the second session, and a warm welcome also to the audience that is joining us online again. In our second panel, we will have a look at the evacuation of museum and library collections and different collection depots. First in Poland and France during the German occupation, two countries from Eastern and Western Europe respectively, before we turn to the collection of a German museum, and finally, a conglomerate of looted book collections whose return has proven to be immensely difficult. Our first speaker is Anna Ziemlewska. She is a historian, art historian, and museum curator from Poland. She received her PhD in history from the University of Torun in 2007. She worked as researcher and employee of the District Museum in Torun, and then, from 2011 until 2016, she worked at the Scientific Center of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Vienna. Since 2017, she has been employed at the Museum of the King Jan III's Palace at Wilanów. Her research focuses on modern history, provenance of collections, as well as looted art. She will be speaking about the Wilanów Museum during the war, not only looting, and we are very excited.
Thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to present history of Wilanów Museum during the World War II. First, a small introduction. The Wilanów Palace is located near Warsaw. Today in Warsaw, was originally a countryside summer house of King Jan I Sobieski. Later, for a short time, the residence of King August the Strong, and aristocratic families, the Czartoryski, Potocki, and Branicki, so the main huge aristocratic families in Poland. The owners of this residence liked to surround themselves with books, pictures, antique vases, Oriental and Baroque furniture, as well as ceramic from Europe and the Far East. The unique collection of art and historical memorabilia of Polish kings and national heroes was open to the public from the very beginning of 19th century. Okay. Because an independent Polish state did not exist at the time, as were no national cultural institution, the private museum in Wilanów fulfilled a number of social and education functions. The collection was exhibited in the royal apartments in the central part of the palace and also in the north wing, rebuilt and adapted to host a painting gallery. The owners, the Potocki family, and since 1892, the Branicki family used the south wing as their private residence. And I show you now the Potocki, the members of Potocki family, Stanisław Kostka-Potocki, the very famous Polish collector called Polish Wilkelman, and also his wife, son, grandson, and the wife of the grandson. Unfortunately, the wonderful portrait of Aleksandra Potocka, Nene Potocka, from Karl von Blas. This is our war loss. We have only a frame, so that's why the photo is. We just saw on the exhibition only an old picture, and also the Branicki family. Ksawery Branicki, a cousin of Alexandra, and I show also the last owner of the palace, Adam Count Branicki, and his wife, Beata Branicka, very famous person for Wilanów collection during the war. This is a photo made in a private apartment in south wing of the palace, and this apartment, this salon, was changed to a photographic atelier during the World War II. So I will show you also photographs of this apartment a few times. In 1932, Count Adam Branicki donated the library, the books, manuscripts, drawings, and graphics to the Polish state. Manuscripts were banned after the Warsaw Uprising, not during, but after the Warsaw Uprising. But books, drawings, graphics survived the war and are still in the National Library today. In the same year, several thousand artworks from Wilanów collection were pledged to the State Agricultural Bank, the largest creditor of Count Branick's multi-million debts. Why I mention that? In connection with the pledge, inventories were created. Thanks to them, we know what was in the Wilanów collection before World War II. It is not obvious, it is not a rule in the case of many private collections in Poland and also in many public collections. The owners were in a difficult financial situation and also collection as palace as well in bad condition. Nonetheless, the Wilanów Museum remained open to the public until August 1939. And I'll show you now the royal apartments. So-called Chinese. I'm sorry. This is a picture gallery. In the north wing, in the North Garden Gallery, and also Chinese apartment on the first floor, and in soft wing. So in this private wing, we have also a porcelain salon, porcelain cabinet with wonderful objects from Meissen manufactory. Capital and its surroundings were deemed safe, so that the Wilanów collection was not evacuated to the East Poland or Romania, or even to Warsaw, as was the case during the First World War. From the first day of the September campaign of 1939, the collections hidden in the cellars or just left in the palace was exposed to artillery fire. After the takeover of Wilanów by Wehrmacht, various small items were looted by soldiers. Late 1939, in voice of Dr. Kajetan Mühlmann, the special representative for securing art and cultural objects in General Government, started to review the collection in order to select those works of art that should be secured, sichergestellt. I use this term secured, but always in quotes, because for me it means confiscation. They should be confiscated. It should also be noted that under the decree of the confiscation of artworks and cultural assets in General Government, works of art created before 1850 were subject to confiscation. This effectively means the entire Wilanów collection, without a few portraits, as neither the Potocki nor the Branický families collected temporary Polish art. Dr. Józef Mühlmann, half-brother of a special representative, and Dr. Paul Harmer selected and secured more than 300 works of art from the Wilanów collection. As you see here, the documents of this securing. However, this takeover, the receipt used the name Übernahme, did not mean that all secured objects were immediately moved from the palace. About 30 paintings were transferred to National Museum in Warsaw, while other artworks remained in the palace. Several dozen masterpieces from Wilanów were to be found in the richly illustrated catalogue Sichergestellte Kunstwerke in Generalgouvernement, 74 to be precise, while the entire catalogue contained over 500 masterpieces. So the Wilanów collection, Wilanów objects, it was 15%. The publication present the results of the special representative office work and featured the most valuable works of art from General Government. Quotation, considered proof of the German culture influence in the East. The end of the quotation. Among them were paintings, furniture, including the famous cabinet given to John III by Pope Innocent XI, Meissen porcelain, Bürger stoneware from Wilanów collection. And now a few photographs, because this catalogue was richly illustrated. We have wonderful photos making during the World War II. And as you see, as you maybe remember and recognize this room, this was everything made in the apartment of Branicki family, so in this south wing in the salon. So we see here, Countess Branicka repeatedly petitioned the authorities of Warsaw General Government to recover the confiscated paintings and to obtain permission to reopen Wilanów Museum, only for German. However, she did not manage to bring the collection back together nor to open a museum. Since 1940, Kai Mühlmann was active in Netherlands, the famous Dienststelle Mühlmann, and did not devote much time to the collection to masterpieces secured in Generalgouvernement. Basically, after the attack of the Netherlands, Belgium, and above all France, the interest of Nazi dignitaries to the Polish collection decreased. The governor, Hans Frank, entrusted them to the Amt für Pflege Alte Kunst, Office for the Protection or Preservation Old Art. In the spring of 1941, the occupying authorities placed the Wilanów collection and the palace under the care of the National Museum in Warsaw. It should be noted that the museum was responsible at the time for several private collections, including those of families Radziwiłł, Raczyński, Czartoryski, also public collections from the Zachęta and Royal Castle, as well as smaller depots from various institutions and individuals. The highly dedicated museum staff, especially Jan Morawiński, and also Dr. Maria Bernhardt, she was an expert in ancient Greek art, and also a group of conservators managed to inventory Wilanów collection, to research, to conserve and restore of paintings, textile, furniture, and antique vases. And we see here one of these paintings, Salome, from a workshop of Kranach. Lucas Kranach, the elder. It was conservation made by Professor Marconi. They work, among others, on the ceiling painting. This is apotheosis of welfare under Saxon rule. Yes, or other sometimes we expect this is apotheosis of science, art, and prosperity in Saxon time. In the Dutch cabinet of the palace, this painting perfectly matched the slogan of the Nazi propaganda about the German presence in the East and the magnificence of the German rule. That's why it was allowed to make a conservation of this painting. Another important task was to protect collection against the air raids, also fungi and mildew. We see this is a famous Turkish tent from the Wilanów collection, and it was cleaning during the summer 1942. But during the occupation, Wilanów was one of the main excursion destinations for Warsaw residents, but also for German officials and Wehrmacht soldiers. And on this courtyard, the courtyard was a place for concert and ballet performances. And now we have a photo of one of these ballet performances. You can imagine how to look like palace and surroundings after such a concert. The occupation authorities of the city and district sought to establish a casino for officers and convalescents in the palace. After the defeats suffered on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1943, this idea of new casino but also the idea of conservation and preservation of the monuments was no longer an option, and so began preparation for evacuation of the collection. In November 1943, 14 chests containing Wilanów work of art and separate parcel with a portrait of August the third on the porcelain, together with other collections previously secured by Mühlmann, were transported to Krakow, to the Wawel Royal Castle, to the headquarters of Hans Frank, but also the main depot of Generalgouvernement. They would not stay there long. As the Red Army was progressing fast in the summer of 1944, it was decided that the works of art had to leave Krakow. The mailing considered the paintings. They were sent to the Palace of Manchern-Sichthofen in Seichau, in Lower Silesia, and then to the Palace on Hans Christi of Wittersheim-Kremst in Mörau. Some of the items left in Mörau were evacuated later by the conservator of Lower Silesia, Günther Grundmann, first to the Schafgott Palace in Bad Warnbrunn and later, at the end, to Coburg. From among the hundreds of valuable items, Hans Frank adjutant Helmut Pfaffenroth took 3 chests full of artworks selected in advance by the governor to Bavaria. Among the others was the portrait of the princess by, was a portrait of princess by Lucas Cranas, the elder from the Wilanów collection. In 1943-1944, evacuation and this transport, well planned and described by the director of the National Museum, Stanisław Lorenz, or by the German authorities, above all by Wilhelm Palaisier. During the escape in January 1945 was no time for artworks. Small format paintings were evacuated, transported in cars, no trucks or trains, in cars, handed over to the local German authorities, or some of these artworks, not only from Polish collection, simply abandoned. The first to reach many of the Silesian castles were the Red Army and also trofejne otriady. And many cultural assets and artworks from this depot were taken to the Soviet Union. At this point, allow me to jump in time to the post-war period. In 1950, several dozen paintings, quotation, taken away by the Nazis from Wilanów Gallery and secured by the Red Army, end of the quotation, were returned to Poland as a gift of the Soviet nation for the Polish nation. Another group of artworks returned 6 years later, together with artworks from collection of National Museum in Warsaw, the Royal Castle in Warsaw, the Gdańsk Museum, and objects from the private collections. In 1996, the painting by Pompeo Battoni, Apollo and Two Moses, was returned to Wilanów collection from the museum in Pawlowsk. That was the last restitution from Russia, and pendant to this painting, allegory of 3 Moses, is still our war loss. But let's return to the Wilanów Palace. And during the Warsaw Uprising, it's been in August and September of 1944. As I mentioned, Wilanów was located a few miles from Warsaw, so not in the center of the fights, but it was a military zone. And in this military zone, the Wehrmacht was supported by Hungarian troops under the command of General Laszlo Szabó. He ordered the Countess Branicka to leave Wilanów, while his soldiers proceeded to looting the palace and its collections. Some paintings were exchanged for vodka and food in the surrounding villages. Others were sent to Hungary. A few were recovered after the war and returned via Vienna to Poland. Officially, these were paintings taken by Polish soldiers who fled through Hungary to the Balkans and France in autumn 1939. At least several paintings from the Wilanów collection, confirmed in Hungarian collection in 1960, are still our war losses. In autumn 1944, the German authorities sent part of the collection in several transports to Lower Silesia. The last looting took place in December 1944. At that time, the portrait of Stanisław Potocki by Jacques Louis David and famous Turkish tent, furniture, and other items were looted. According to witnesses, it was done by quotation Major Weizenstein from the Military Museum in Munich, at the end of quotation. For years, this person would remain as mysterious figure. It has now been established, thanks to Katharina Maria Kontne, that it was actually Hans-Robert Weihrauch from the Dienststelle Chef de Heeres Museum, a long-time director of Staatliche Kunstsammlungen in Augsburg, and after the war, the curator and director of the Bavarian National Museum. Conclusion. The fate of the Wilanów collection was similar to fate of the other collection of Polish aristocratic families. The collection of part were confiscated, the most valuable works were secured, and in 1943 and 1944 were taken to Krakow or directly to the depots in Lower Silesia, and there again secured by Trofejne Otriady and taken to Soviet Union. In many ways, however, the fate of the palace and its collection was unique. They were not destroyed as a result of war operation, as a result of fight during the Warsaw Uprising, nor destroyed after the collapse of the uprising, like, for example, Krasiński Library. It was possible to inventory, to preserve and conserve a large part of the collection. What undoubtedly distinguishes Wilanów from other collections is a Hungaria looting episode. This is a topic worth investigating, as such studies could not be taken in the 1960s when some paintings from Wilanów were found, quotation, in a private Hungaria collection, end of quotation. At the beginning of 1945, the palace and its collection became a branch of the National Museum in Warsaw and were nationalized with it a few months later. Artworks from Wilanów, which returned to Warsaw after the war from Krakow, from this Wawel Castle depots, from Silesia, from Bavaria, this was from collecting point in Munich, a few transport, and also from Salzburg and from the Soviet Union, were often stored in depots and exhibited in the headquarters of the National Museum in Warsaw, but were not sent back to Wilanów. The separation of the Wilanów collection from the collection of the National Museum was a long and difficult process, still unfinished. We, or our colleagues from National Museum, still find paintings or frames of Wilanów provenance in the collection of the National Museum, and we still find objects with provenance of National Museum in our collection. Digitalization of archives and work of art, the advances in provenance research in many Polish collections, and also cooperation with Ministry of Culture and the National Heritage make possible to identify the objects and war losses in our own collection. We have such cases in our own collection. In collections of other museums in Poland and also abroad, we have a few such objects from Staatliche Kunstsammlungen in Dresden, thanks Daphne project, from private collection, in private collection and also in actions. This gives us a hope that valuable paintings by Dutch, French, and Italian painters, as well as pieces of furniture, like a famous cabinet of John III, will someday return to Wilanów, or at least will be found. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your detailed insight. We have now a few minutes left for questions and comments, or maybe just one question or one comment. If you would like to say something, feel free to come to the aisle to our microphone. I see no one moving. Oh, yes.
Do you know if Hans Posse visited Warsaw in December 1939? I think he was only in the National Museum. Was he also in the...
Posse?
Hans Posse.
Yes, we have a few noticed that someone not from General Government, so not from Mühlmann, was in Wilanów, so it's possible it was Posen.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
And we will move on to the next speaker. Moving on, we will now come from the Versailles of Poland to the Versailles in France. Coming up next is Bonnotte Khelil. She works as a researcher in the National Museum of the Palace of Versailles, specializing in the history of the Château de Versailles from the 1870s to the present day. She has published 2 books on the history of the Palace of Versailles during the Second World War, and she also works as provenance researcher for the museum's collections. Last year, she published an anthology together with Christina Kott, focusing on the protection measures of palaces and museums in the Paris region during the Second World War. They are also co-directing a program called Châteaux and Museums in Europe, an artistic heritage in the face of war from the 19th to the 21st century, which is run by the Research Center of the Palace of Versailles. So, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, dear Fine. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to express my warmest gratitude to the whole team of the Lost Art Foundation for inviting me. The organization of this conference is absolutely perfect, and it's both a great pleasure for me to take part in this event and an honor to speak here in the Berlin Library on behalf of the Palace of Versailles. For many years, I've been working on the history of the Palace of Versailles during the Second World War. This research led me to organize a conference in 2021 on the protection of the Châteaux and Museum of the Paris region during wartime. It was very important for me to understand how the other châteaux near the capital had been protected and what lessons and comparison could be drawn with Versailles. The contributions to this conference were published last year, as you can see here on the screen, the program of this former symposium, and the book cover of the conference proceedings published by Hermann Editor. During this conference, I've teamed up with Christina Kott, a German historian that many here may know, to set up a broader research program on the history of European palaces and museums during the war, chateaux and museums in Europe, and artistic heritage in the face of war, 19th, 20th century. The webpage details the action we are carried out with the support of the Versailles Palace Research Center. You can see on the screen the announcement of the online conference we are organizing next month on the protection of France's national heritage during the Cold War. As you may know, a large proportion of French national and regional museum collections were evacuated in 1939 to areas deemed to be far from the front. A large part of the national collections held in Paris ended up in the Loire region, notably at the Château de Chambord. Just over 80 repositories have existed between 1939 and 1946. Most of them were set up in châteaux, mainly in the west of France, with some changes over the course of the conflict. While it is interesting to study the way in which French museums protected themselves during the war, it is equally fascinating to study the way. It is equally fascinating to analyze the way in which they communicated about it at the end of the war. My speak today will focus on the communication made around the return of French national collection from repositories in 1945. With a few exceptions, these operations began after Germany's capitulation in May. The most striking expression of this communication can be found in filmed newsreels. A first movie called Art Rediscovered was filmed in Chambord on the Louvre Museum and broadcasted in summer 1945. I have transcribed part of the audio commentary here, with particularly enlightening passages. The two main messages contained in this movie are, firstly, the collection had slept peacefully in their crates, where they had been retreating during the war. Secondly, these collections have not been altered in any way over all these years. No one has aged, as reported the journalist. A second movie with the same title, Art Rediscovered, shot a few weeks later, developed these same ideas, but in an even more heroic tone. Works of art are compared with heroes of the past, reduced to ghostly figures during the war, making a triumphant return to their original museums in 1945. The main focus here is on the Louvre, but examples from the châteaux of Versailles on Malmaison are also mentioned. Thanks to this successful homecoming, the museums and their staff have also awakened from a long melancholy sleep. Lastly, another French movie broadcasted in 1946 made an interesting parallel between French, Russian, and English depots. This film tends to show that France, like other victorious nations, had protected its artistic treasures in areas far from the conflict. France was no exception in this matter, as the commentator reminded us. There is a similarity in the vocabulary used in these three short documentaries. It is always, more or less, a question of a return from exile or a coming out of retirement. These movies also give the impression that many of the works had been already returned from deposits or were in the process of being returned. Is this really true? I propose to analyze the different arguments put forward. In more ways than one, there are approximations in the way the facts are reported in these movies. First of all, the story is obviously embellished with an almost systematic focus on the Louvre Museum. Although it is the largest museum in France, it is not the only representative example. Secondly, there are a number of reasons why national museums could not immediately return works to their original institutions in 1945. There was a lack of trucks, but also a lack of fuel, and some museums were not yet able to receive their collections. Museums have not all reopened to public in 1945. Thirdly, the works that have remained in repositories for up to 6 years, sometimes inside crates, and these properties were not all in a good state of conservation. Some examples clearly show that the works suffered during the war and that some of them required important restorations. In my opinion, many accounts have indeed embellished this operation, in reality much more contrasted. My analysis is based in particular on my study of the example of the Palace of Versailles. The museum did not reopen completely until summer 1946 because restoration operations took a long time. The palace had been considerably altered from the start of the war by major passive defense measures, which affected its decor in particular. The palace had hosted the signing of the peace treaty ending the First World War, and it was feared that the Third Reich would demolish the symbol of the 1919 diktat. As a result, the palace protection program was adapted to the risks involved. The architect had a large number of decorations dismantled, notably the carved and gilded wall paneling, which have been sent to provincial châteaux as a precautionary measure. The garden sculptures had also left Versailles. Charles-Maurice Beaupré, the museum curator, worked hard after the war in order to reinstall the works, as can be seen here on the right of the ladder, surrounded by his team. The works from the Versailles Museum that have been evacuated in 1939 began to return home from the end of 1945 to the middle of the year 1946. Many of the works returned from the châteaux of Brissac, Chambord, and Sourches in a fairly poor state of conservation. Our painter-restorer at the time, Pierre Paulet, restored many paintings between 1945 and 1946 inside the museum. Returned back in Versailles, many works of art required extensive restorations, and these damages were not limited to paintings. The works of art have also suffered greatly from humidity and from packaging material used. This is the case of Antoine Morand's clock stored at the Château de Brissac from 1939 to 1945. In an interview given in 1933, Versailles craftsman Pierre Bécard explained the difficulties he encountered in restoring this jewel of 18th century silverware. Here is what he said, I quote, "The object had been conscientiously packed, but in the case of Morand's clock, as with other things, they had been wrapped in greaseproof paper, and no one could have foreseen that the war would last 4 years. So I found the clock in an appalling state of rust. The greaseproof paper had penetrated the metal. It was that bad. It took nearly 5 months to remove the rust and whitewash the 99 or so pieces of wrought iron. Then, first of all, we had to find some materials, which wasn't easy, I swear. In particular, we had to exchange a bottle of wine for copper wire, give up our shoe coupons to get some screws. In short, it was something truly incredible. This broken archive is a particularly good illustration of the material difficulties associated with permanent rationing in France. Firstly, even if the French national collections were little affected by the Nazi looting, some works were still missing in summer 1945, such as Kugler Herat's Marie Magdalene from the Louvre Museum, brought back to Germany by Hermann Göring, which was finally returned to France in 1946. On the right, you can see the famous medieval sculpture as photographs at Munich's collection point. Similarly, some archaeological pieces from the collections of the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye have disappeared from the crates in which they were kept. These disappearances of works of art were nonetheless very anecdotal compared with the looting of private collections, particularly those of Jewish collectors. Over and above the question of approximation, it is interesting to see how much interest there was in the issue of repositories returns. At the beginning of August, the photographic department of the New York Times expressed its desire to cover the return of the works evacuated from the Palace of Versailles. As nothing had happened yet, the curator and his colleagues were asked to simulate the operations using paintings left in the museum. Marguerite Jaloux, the curator's assistant, wrote in her diary on 8 August 1945, "The New York Times calls to photograph evacuation returns. As I reply that nothing has happened yet, I am asked to simulate a return with paintings from the museum. Answer, no." Despite being turned down, the reporter produced a report inside the palaces consisting of around 10 shots of a more or less artificial nature. Here we see two American women wearing the Women's Army Corps uniforms. They are examining on their knees the Dauphine's carriage. Interesting detail of the story, this carriage never left Versailles during the conflict. Here we see them in a room on the right of the Grand Trianon, around many high crates. Once again, these paintings from the château's collections were stored at the Grand Trianon before the beginning of the war. These works had not moved from that spot. To my knowledge, these pictures have never been published. Beyond the interest of these photos, it is important to remember that the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been based at the Hotel Trianon Palace close to the chateau since September 1944. Many American troops were therefore stationed in the town. It is therefore particularly interesting to analyze or understand this communication and the way in which it enabled Jacques Jaujard, director of the Louvre National Museum, to be elevated to the status of a national hero by his colleagues and near collaborators. Jacques Jaujard's works, deserving though it was probably overrated to the detriment of others, such as the former director of Fine Arts, Georges Huysmans, who was dismissed in 1940. Last November, Christina Cott and I organized a study day on this subject to recall its role in the interwar war period. The presentations given during the day are available on the Château Research Center's YouTube channel. Thanks to the conservation campaign that Jacques Jaujard actively orchestrated, the Mona Lisa kept her smile as various observers enjoyed telling this story. Here she was finally back in June 1945 at the Louvre, still in her crate. Many came to see her close after a 6-year absence in the south of France. In July, the famous Leonardo da Vinci's painting was presented as a guest star in the exhibition of masterpieces in the Louvre Museum. Generally speaking, there was little room for criticism, even though some curators, such as Charles-Maurice Beaupré in Versailles, expressed in 1947 a somewhat dissonant opinion. Alongside human lives, war directly threatens monuments and works of art. All projections are fairly futile and often almost as dangerous as the war itself. Needless to say, this is a very rare observation from a curator, especially in the first few years after the end of the war. In Versailles, the lack of heating caused far more damage than the war itself. Charles-Maurice Beaupré saw the risk involved in overprotecting the chateau and its collection, particularly at the beginning of the war. Today, the backdrop of Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine reminds us of often protective measures are repeated over time. In France, for example, the use of sandbags to protect works of art dates back to 1870. It remains one of the most effective practices according to heritage professionals. In the majority of cases, the praise was unanimous, as shown by Rose Valland, Fond de l'Art, written in 1961. The national collection had been saved from destruction, saved from Nazi greed, that could be handed over intact to a liberated France. Rose Valland also introduced in her book the idea that this success was also partly due to luck. However, there is always the question of affirming that the National Museum collection were fully intact in 1945. More than 15 years after the end of the war, France's National Museum were still full of praise for their work. The national collections were returned to a liberated France, which deserved them back. But had all these works been concerned by Nazi greed? While the risks had been real for some of them, as for the Marie Magdalene by Gregory Wright, it did not concern all the works from the national collections. In France, a large number of curators wrote their memoirs in the post-war period. Their writings reveal their confidence in the system put in place by the national museums. While some, such as Lucie Mazurek, admitted that the crates were in poor condition at the end of the war, the result was considered rather miraculous. In the 1950s, the Cold War context once again prompted museum curators to think about a new protective system. Very often, some of them mentioned the use of their methods, even though the use of castles as repositories was clearly no longer envisaged. As the means of destruction evolved, railway tunnels and even German bunkers were preferred. However, the success of National Museum in preparing for war and resisting occupation is still remembered even decades later. Germain Bazin, curator of paintings at the Louvre Museum, offered perhaps the most unexpected praise in this matter in 1992. Could France have won the war if it had been as well prepared at the Musée de France? The story of French museum protection during World War II is set up as a symbol of a French victory in opposition with the country's strange defeat, as described by historian Marc Bloch. This provocative question raises a number of issues. By way of conclusion, I submit to you my own questioning. Did this exaggerated vision intend to obscure the failure of National Museum to preserve the private collections they were responsible for in these same repositories? It was always the best explanation given to the public for having closed major museums during many years. While I don't have the answer today, those questions are worth asking. Thank you for your attention. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much for this detailed and impressive presentation. There's room for questions now again. Please come to the microphone. Claire, you described that the return of the artworks was framed very positively, so as a return from holidays or something like that. And I wonder, could you go into a bit more detail why that was the case and whose idea in the end was it?
I think that's the two questioning I put in my conclusion. I think it was the best way for a National Museum to explain the fact that the museums were closed for many years because masterpieces were out of Paris during almost 6 years. And there is also the question of the private collections that were protected normally with in the same depositories, and it took a long time for museum agents to talk about it.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Anna Holzer-Kawalko, thank you very much. I come from totally different background, so really, out of curiosity, I was looking while we were talking at the title of your talk, and it ends with the story of a national victory. And there was a lot of collectivity in what you said about, but I am curious, you as an expert, as a curator, could you tell me if you see it really as this national victory, as something collective, systematic, as a victory of a system, or rather, because on the other hand, this was the second impression that I got from your talk, was it a story of numerous individuals and rather personal agencies involved, and their inventfulness and their energy to rush to protect and sell those works of art? So was it a system that responded so well, or rather a group of people that were right on time with right energies, and we should give more appreciation to them as opposed to this national framework that maybe was a little bit of staged? There was a lot of staging in your talk, so yeah, I was curious also about that.
Thank you for a question. I think there's two things. It's a story about collections, but it is also it's a system. It's the organization, and what I wanted to say, there was an enlightenment around the Louvre, because the National Museum, the French National Museum, were directed by the Louvre at this time. So the communication is very related with the Louvre system, if I can use this expression. And it was as well a story of a system, what they did and what they were proud of, but as well a story of persons, and it's a pity because all the witnesses of sorry for my poor English. All the witnesses haven't written their memoirs. It would maybe have been different. It would have been a different communication if we had different témoignages. Sorry for the word in French. I don't know but we can speak together. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Oh yeah, I see one.
Nathalie Neumann, I'm a French-German provenance researcher, and thank you very much for your talk, Claire. I was wondering if I may make this comment. So the French situation seems to be very an entity, but under the surface, there are a couple of interesting stories due to the other relation between the German occupant and the French museum's structures. So Christina Cotte, who is preparing her habilitation, her professor thesis, is saying that they are in constant communication, discussion about the moving of crates, about the visits to the deposits, that in Paris, in Versailles, in Chambord, the Germans had the power to seize Jewish collectors' boxes and collections, even though they should have been under the protection of the Louvre, whereas in the southwest, and we did this conference last year in Montal, on the 7 castles there it was the contrary. Rothschild family could hide some of their boxes with the curator there, who was just labeling those boxes being national property, and they kept untouched during World War II. And there's another case, that one in Pau, about the national Belgian property, the altarpiece of Gand, who was taken under force with a gun through the German occupant. So it's a very rich underlying of other stories. And thanks to your work, this has been, in parts also be published in your book.
But I haven't detailed all the operations between 1939 and 1945. I've focused on the return.
All right. Any other questions? So then I'd say thank you very much. And we are now looking at the fate of the Städel Museum's collection presented by Iris Schmeisser. She has been working as provenance researcher and head of archives at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt since 2014. She previously worked as curatorial assistant and provenance researcher of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Her current research and exhibition project centers on Georg Swasensky, who was an art historian and director of the Städel Museum from 1906 until 1937, focusing on his last years in Frankfurt and his time in exile. Iris Schmeisser is now presenting on the Städel Museum's collection during the war and the American occupation. Welcome to the stage.
And thank you for having me here. I have to apologize in advance. I have a bit of a bad cough, and I hope this is not going to disrupt my presentation. What I'm going to present to you today is actually the result of a provenance research project on a painting by Josef Anton Koch I did several years ago, a work of art the Städel Museum acquired in 1832, lost at an evacuation site in Upper Franconia in 1945, and got back after it resurfaced in the estate of a private owner in Missouri in 2018. In the course of this research, in which I attempted to trace the painting's path from 1939, when it left the museum's galleries, to where it ended up in 2018, I was led to various files labeled Auslagerungen, relocation, evacuation, and Luftschutz, civil air defense, in our archives, which I, up to then, had never systematically consulted, revealing a highly disturbing and chilling documentation of a society completely unhinged. Painting found, it said in the header of the message that I received in my Outlook inbox one day in the late fall of 2018. In this email, an American owner informed me that she presumably found a painting that once belonged to the Städel Museum, Landscape with Balaam and His Donkey by Josef Anton Koch. She had inherited the painting from her father. Since she happened to be an art historian and a museum employee herself, she knew she needed to check its provenance. Her own due diligence led her to a match in the database Lost Art.de, in which the Städel Museum had registered it as missing. About a year later, in 2019, she brought the painting back to Frankfurt and generously returned it to the museum. The Städel Museum was still young when it acquired the painting, together with another work by the artist, The Rape of Hylas, directly from his studio in Rome in 1832. The Städel Art Institute, as it was originally called, was founded in 1815 by the Frankfurt banker and merchant Johann Friedrich Städel. In his last will, Städel had bequeathed his assets, including his art collection and almost 500 objects, to a yet-to-be-founded art museum and art school. To this day, our museum is a privately owned art institution, which relies heavily on donations and bequests. The two landscapes by Koch, however, as you see in the copy of the museum's accession book, inventory numbers 848 and 849, actually entered the collection as a purchase of contemporary art. In a digital reconstruction of the museum's galleries in 1878, the time travel project by my colleague Jochen Sander and his team, you can see how it was installed back then. In the 1920s, Koch's paintings were installed in the galleries surrounding the so-called Goethe Room and grouped with the Romantics and Nazarenes. In order to understand the history of the Städel Museum's collection and the fate of its staff during the years 1933 to 1945, it is necessary to briefly lay out the somewhat complicated structure of this institution and how it came about. What we call the Städel Museum today actually unites two collections under one roof. First, the collection owned by the Städel Art Institute, and second, the collection owned by the city of Frankfurt. And you can imagine that this makes a big difference during the Nazi era. Thus, different ownership, status, and administration. The latter was built in 1907, the city of Frankfurt's collection, with the help of a substantial bequest the city received to build a collection of contemporary art. The so-called Städtische Galerie was attached to the Städel Art Institute and in fact housed in the same building. At first, director and my favorite research topic was Georg Swatzenski, who was head of the Städel Art Institute and the newly founded city's collection, thus straddling two separate yet interwoven administrative structures. To make things even more complicated, in 1928 he was appointed director at large of all museums owned by the city of Frankfurt, and his assistant Alfred Wolters became director of the city's collection, while Swatzenski continued to lead the Städel Art Institute, the two working side by side. In 1933, the city of Frankfurt cancelled Swatzenski's contract because he was Jewish. But he would manage to remain in his position as the head of the privately run Städel Art Institute until its administration succumbed to the pressure of the Gauleitung and forced him to retire in September 1937. He was replaced by Ernst Holzinger, who you see here at the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point, who then teamed up with Wolters, the two of them jointly running the museum, yet with different collections under their responsibility. While Holzinger headed a privately owned art collection, to which Koch's painting Landscape with Balaam and his donkey belonged, and had to report to a board of 5 trustees, 3 of which were members of the Nazi party by then, Wolters was in charge of a city-owned art collection and under the administration of Frankfurt's mayor, Friedrich Krebs, and its Kulturamt, Department of Culture. After the war, both Holzinger and Wolters remained in place as directors of their respective collections, the holdings of the Städel Art Institute and the holdings of the city. I'm mentioning this at length as they were not only the ones who were responsible for the acquisitions during the Nazi era and the evacuation of their collections during the war. In fact, Wolters kept an official Kriegstagebuch, war diary, from 1939 to 1945. They were also in charge of the post-1945 rehabilitation of the museum and its collection and the restitution of looted art. Both thus embody continuities and discontinuities. On September 19, 1935, 4 days after the Nuremberg race laws came into effect, Georg Swatzenski, still in charge of the Städel Art Institute, but under increasingly unbearable pressure, reported on the recommendation for the protection of paintings against air raids, Vorschläge zum Schutz der Gemälde gegen Luftangriffe, at the meeting of the museum's trustees. The minutes of the meeting recorded, quote, "The trustees agree that in case of danger, the most important paintings will be removed to an off-site location. The director will look for a suitable location," unquote. They had responded to a letter the Städel Institute had received from the Department of Construction Air Defense Unit, Bauamt, Abteilung Luftschutz. It was agreed that the paintings of the Städel Art Institute's collection should be evacuated together with the paintings from the city's holdings. Thus, Wolters noted in his war diary, quote, "A list
of 184 paintings was compiled. 64 boxes and packing material was provided by the city. The boxes were sprayed with fire suppressant spray, numbered, and the insides of its lids labeled with the painting's titles. Initial plans to consider the greenhouse, Gewächshaus, at Laubach Castle, about 80 kilometers north of the city of Frankfurt, were soon abandoned, since it seemed unsuitable. During a drill in 1938, the most valuable paintings were taken off the walls, crated, and deposited in the vaults of the museum building. The whole measure was reported to have taken 2 full days. Another measure was taken when in March 1939, the trustees of the Städel Art Institute agreed to the order of the city's Department of Construction to have Luftschutzräume, air raid shelters, built in the basement of the museum. On May 11, 1939, the minutes of the Städel Art Institute's administration's meeting hence recorded the following, quote, "The city agreed to have air raid shelters built in the basement of the Galerie Altbau for material goods, Sachwerte, and people. The administration hereby consents." I'm just sharing this document with you, and then, some more documentation. For the most indispensable, here you see the actual shelter built underneath the museum, and it's actually still there. For the most indispensable and valuable works of art from the collection of the Städel Art Institute and the city, a new off-site location had to be found. At the suggestion of Mayor Friedrich Krebs, this was to be Oberstetten, approximately 30 kilometers north of Frankfurt. In the files, the location is usually referred to as Liegenschaft des Hospitals zum Heiligen Geist, which translates to property of the hospital. In fact, this property was the building formerly owned by the Kann-Stiftung, Kann Foundation, which had been Aryanized by the hospital. Several days before Germany invaded and declared war on Poland, Wolters noted in his war diary on August 24, 1939, quote, "At 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the city's person in charge of the Department of Construction and Air Defense issued the order that those paintings designated for transport should be packed and prepared so that they can be picked up at 7 a.m. the following day. As soon as the galleries were closed, we began to crate the paintings. All of the available museum staff assisted in the preparation of the paintings for transport. The measures took until midnight." Wolters noted on the following day, quote, "At 8 a.m., the 44 crates containing 178 paintings, of which 63 are owned by the city, are loaded onto the trucks. An inventory is made. On each of the 3 trucks, at least 1 staff member is present. The transfer went smoothly. Director Dr. Holzinger and his colleague, were also present during the transport to control the unloading and storing of the crates in Oberstetten. Also taken to Oberstetten were portions of the, quote, recently acquired, unquote, collections of Max von Goldschmidt-Rothschild and Karl von Weinberg, sold under duress to the city of Frankfurt in the fall of 1938. The lists of the paintings evacuated to Oberstetten were stored in a safe, Stahlkammer. The doors to the storage areas were secured with sand-filled crates. Museum staff was on site day and night to guard the artworks in storage there. On August 27, 1939, all remaining paintings in the galleries were removed, divided according to medium, canvas and wood, and transferred to the basement vault. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded and declared war on Poland. On this day, Reichsminister der Luftfahrt und Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe Hermann Göring informed museum staff about the following, quote, guidelines for the implementation of air raid protection in museums, libraries and archives, unquote. Richtlinien für die Durchführung des Luftschutzes in Museen, Büchereien, Archiven und ähnlichen Kulturstätten. The collections were supposed to divide it into 3 categories. First, culturally and historically significant and absolutely irreplaceable works of art. These should be evacuated to a bomb and fire-safe location. Second, works of arts and science which are particularly valuable but do not fall in the first category. These were to be transferred to the air raid shelters of the institution. All other works were to remain on site, but doors and windows should be protected against shrapnel and poisonous effects from bombs. Splitter- und Kampfstoffwirkung von Fliegerbomben. After the first air raid on Frankfurt occurred in June 1940, pressure to evacuate the artworks that had remained on site increased. On June 6, 1941, about 250 paintings still stored at the museum, including the landscape by Koch, were transferred to the vaults of the former Bank, which the city had rented for that purpose. Wolters reported that the museum's building's glass ceilings had been continuously hit by fallen debris from the aircraft artillery flak. On May 23, 1941, more paintings were transferred from the museum building to the vault of the Reichsbank Hauptstelle, Taunusanlage 5. The following year, on June 7, 1942, Wolters even traveled to Berlin to attend a meeting at the Reichsanstalt der Luftwaffe für Luftschutz for museum directors and conservators on the topic of protection of artworks during the war. After the war escalated and air raids increased, Oberstetten was considered no longer safe enough. On August 26, 1942, vehicles sent by the city, including 5 municipal garbage trucks used for transportation, moved the paintings stored at Oberstetten. Eventually, the Städel Museum evacuated pretty much the whole collection to a large-scale bomb shelter outside of the city in a place called Ziegenberg in the Taunus. It was a monumental shelter complex and headquarters Hitler had built in the fall of 1939, developed after plans by his architect Albert Speer. Once the artworks were deposited there, the doors were securely locked. One key was left with the Ziegenberg administration in a sealed envelope. The other key was put in the fireproof safe of the museum building. The windows of the museum building itself were bricked up, zugemauert. On September 8, Wehrmacht officers of the Air Force inspected the museum building's roof, and suggested the installment of anti-aircraft artillery's flags there, which staff adamantly rejected. Since the administration of the Städel Art Institute refused to have its roof used for Flak-Einsatz, anti-aircraft artilleries, the Department of Construction simply issued a confiscation order, Beschlagnahmeverfügung, for the roof space, and cleared the path to have 3 flags placed there, increasing pressure on museum staff to clear the building entirely of artworks. In his review of the year 1942, Wolters noted, quote, "The past year was all about air defense," unquote. Unthinkable. He continued, quote, "The building of the Städel Art Institute has been completely emptied out," unquote. The detailed rendition in Wolters' war diary of the evacuation and conservation measures in these years is crudely and matter-of-factly interspersed with references to acquisitions of looted art and purchases in Nazi-occupied France and the Netherlands. In May 1939, Wolters had been officially appointed one of 32 national art appraisers for the Devisenstelle. In this capacity, he was in charge of deciding which artworks and cultural objects were classified as nationally significant and could therefore not be exported by Jewish owners forced to flee the country. In August 1941, the Reich Chamber of Art authorized Holzinger to act as an art appraiser for securing and processing German cultural objects from Jewish property. After having been emptied of the permanent collection, the museum still operated for a short while. Its space was used for propaganda exhibitions such as Unser Heer in October 1943, until it was finally closed to visitors at the end of the year. On January 29, 1944, the building of the museum was severely damaged during an American air raid, which attacked the flags on its roof, followed by another air raid damage, which occurred on November 5, 1944. including its air raid shelter. Finally, in the summer of 1944, museum staff was faced with the challenge of having to clear the Ziegenberg offsite storage in a very short space of time. On July 20, 1944, the museum received the dramatic news that Ziegenberg had to be evacuated immediately, as it would be returned to its original military use. The museum staff, already decimated by the draft of many employees for military service, now had to completely empty the evacuation site within 2 weeks. Just 1 week later, Koch's landscape with the prophet Balaam was one of the first transports from Ziegenberg in the Taunus to Amorbach in the Odenwald, about 100 kilometers away, where the painting was housed in a former Benedictine abbey from the 18th century, together with about 400 other paintings. And here you see actually a map of all the evacuation sites, not only where the Städel Museum's collection was deposited, but also other city-owned collections. At the end of July 1944 and beginning of August 1944, all collections stored off-site at Ziegenberg were transferred to castles in Rosbach, Amorbach, Kleinholbach, and to a bunker complex in Wildungen. And also interesting what you see here, actually not only the city's collection and the Städel Art Institute's collection, but also private owners had deposited artworks at the Städel Art Institute, for example, Henkel, but also the Sammlung Hagemann, which most of you are familiar with. It's a private collection of expressionist works, primarily Kirchner. And Hagemann died during the war by an accident, and his heirs did not know what to do with the collection. And because Holzinger was actually the head of a private art institution, he was able to safeguard the so-called degenerate artworks from Hagemann's private collection and actually protect them from war damage by evacuating the private collection of so-called degenerate artworks with the Städel Museum's own holdings. All sites were marked with a sign from the High Command of the Wehrmacht indicating, quote, valuable German cultural assets are stored here, unquote. The works of art stored there were never inspected by Städel's staff again until the end of the war. In March 1945, the last of altogether 75 bomb raids hit Frankfurt, and American troops reached the River Main and the city of Frankfurt. On March 26, 1945, Wolters noted in his war diary that American soldiers searched and temporarily occupied the museum buildings. And then he noted from April 8 to April 14, quote, we are trying to get off limits for the museum building and the evacuation sites. From end of April to beginning of May, he recorded that there were repeated requests by American soldiers to visit the museum. On April 18, a curator from the Frankfurt Historical Museum traveled to Amorbach with a special permit. This is still during times of war, to check in on the evacuation site. In a memo he later wrote up, he noted that the storage facilities were occupied by the American troops and that they had been broken. It is only 3 months later that 2 staff members of the Städel Museum made it to Amorbach Castle by bike. They reported 25 paintings, including the landscape by Koch, as missing. In the meantime, the monuments man set up shop at the Landesmuseum in Wiesbaden, and here you actually see Ernst Holzinger at the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point, because Holzinger was involved in the activities of the monuments man as chief German expert and assisted in surveying, identifying, and cataloging the artworks at the collecting point. He reported the Amorbach case to the American officers in charge and noted that, quote, the building was broken into after the American occupation, unquote. The Städel Museum subsequently filed for compensation of its lost artworks at the Amorbach storage site. The amount of works missing prompted the Städel Art Institute to issue a catalogue of stolen works, Diebstahlkatalog. It had received permission to do so by the publication's control officer. The Diebstahlkatalog was sent to an impressive array of museums, art dealers, and private collectors. The catalogue was printed in an edition of 800 and sent to 39 museums in Germany, 48 police stations, and numerous art historians and art dealers in Germany and abroad. So far, several artworks that were lost at the evacuation sites have resurfaced on the art market and were reunited with the collection again. The last one being the landscape by Josef Anton Koch, but one of our most famous and revered paintings by Max Liebermann was showed up again in an auction. This was taken by Sinclair Robinson, who you saw in the picture, from Büdingen, another town. There you see him. And he was actually tried in front of the American military because of the theft. And so this painting, which belonged to the Städel Art Institute, was then reacquired in 1964. And unlike Koch's painting, this painting had left the galleries in 1936, because this is when Jewish artists were no longer put on display at the museum. And it was evacuated and then stolen and resurfaced in 1964 and is now again part of our collection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again for this very interesting presentation. I'm still a bit excited. That was a real crime story revolving around hidden Nazi bank vaults and headquarters. I like the map that you showed of the evacuation sites. Could you tell us which other institutions also evacuated into the Ziegenberg bomb shelter?
Yes, I mean all the city-owned art museums, they have different names now. The Stadtgeschichtliches Museum is now a Historisches Museum, and the Museum für angewandte Kunst as well. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience now?
Christian Fuhrmeister, Zentralinstitut. One question, or I'm missing one point, and that would be the German war art collection being displayed in the Städel, because you have presented a very, let's say, systemic and rich overview, but this is yet another layer. So that's the one, and I do have one question. The acquisition in '64, so it was not claimed, it was considered something that only money can solve. Could you please expand?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. These are two very good questions. I mean, your question about actually propaganda exhibitions at the Städel, definitely. I mean, I only mentioned one, but as early as 1934, you know, the Kraft durch Freude exhibitions, you name it. And this is something that personally I have not worked on, but you know, at some point we're planning on a detailed chronology of our exhibitions, and this would certainly be a topic. Your second question, my spontaneous actually response is to invite you to the archives and look at our folders. Just for, I mean, we have several ones, but this case. So there are two instances of theft, basically. The painting by Josef Anton Koch, the GIs who took a certain amount of artworks there, that was Amorbach. So that was very early on, that was in 1945. And then this GI you saw, Sinclair Robinson, who's actually a lawyer. He was informed that you know, the collection had been violated, and he took several artworks, including the Liebermann, and transferred it to another location he was in charge of in Büdingen. And this is all very, very well documented. You can go on fold 3 and you can download the whole trial in front of the American military. There was a huge investigation. They had witnesses which they inquired, and he, since he was a lawyer, he never admitted to anything. He always referred to the 24th article of the war law, which basically I assume just meant that he didn't have to say anything, and he actually got away with it. He never was tried. And the Städel Museum itself informed the police and actually hired a lawyer to pursue these works that were taken from the evacuation site, especially when they showed up again in 1964. And the consigner of the Liebermann was actually a person named, I think, Gail Robinson. So she must be a relative of Sinclair Robinson, of course. The other consigners, I don't know. But yeah, they showed up on the art market, Sotheby's in 1964. And then actually the museum hired a lawyer and got in touch with some of the owners presently known at the time, and they reacquired, and they made a deal. You know, they paid like 300 mark at the time, made a deal, a settlement to get the works back. But yeah, the whole legal question is a whole a very interesting topic in and of itself, but you're very welcome to look at these files, and yeah, it's certainly very fascinating.
We've got another question, please.
Anne Kuhlmann-Smirnov from the Prussian Castles and Gardens. We're working on private collections and the way they were sheltered in the Second World War. And you mentioned these private collections, which were also somehow appeared in your documentations. And I wanted to ask you if you have any evidence of an involvement of the provincial administration in that what matters, the private collections, because we found a lot of documentations about the provincial conservators who had the duty of bringing these objects from private possessions in new shelters.
I have to rephrase your question to make sure I understood correctly. So your question is if we have any documentation in terms of the conservation conservation treatment and sort of curatorial care of the private works?
Yeah, it's just who was in charge of the sheltering of private collections.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have read or...
Yeah. Not the city, but the private Städel Art Institute, which is significant. Because in that case, it was considered private property and the state did not have any access. This makes the situation very unique. And if you look at the list that I showed you of the works that were on disposit, there are two kinds. There are works that were left behind by Jewish owners who had to flee. And there are some of them we listed them on Lost Art because we have not been able to reconnect them to their owners. There was also the art collection of Jakob Nussbaum. He was an artist, a local Frankfurt artist. He fled to what was then British Mandate Palestine in 1934, but he then had the collection actually retrieved. Yeah, so this was a whole mixed bag, and then you have the collection of the the heirs of Karl Hagemann. Yeah, which and it's very interesting when you look at the documentation. It's a very thin line. You just see Hagemann. You know, it was really so that it would not be seen that it's a huge collection, and the heirs actually bequeathed works on paper in 1948 to the museum as an act of gratitude for safeguarding it.
Okay.
I don't know if it answers your question, but yeah, that's all I can say. And of course, after 1945, the works by, let's say, Georg Hartmann, you know, who had his works evacuated there, or Elisabeth Winterhalter, the partner of Ottilie Röderstein, she also had works from her collection stored there. They went to the central collecting point, you know, when they were recovered after 1945, and then they actually had to retrieve them from there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, but a quick one.
Thank you. Very, very good question. My name is Alan Auld, translator based in Munich. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wondered if you could say something generally about what happened to what you mentioned, die Genrede Art, the Arte der Kunst. Was there some sort of particular path that these paintings followed? I know that they were put into these sort of shaming exhibitions. How were they treated after that? Were they kind of tend to be saved by individuals, or was there as an official sort of way in which those paintings were dealt with?
Thank you for your question. Were you asking about the works owned by the museum, the modern artworks that were then declared degenerate, or the private?
Talking about sort of the degenerate art in general, really.
I mean, at the Städel Museum, there are several phases. I mean, and it, again, it's interesting because, you know, by the time you get to the 1930s, basically the collecting strategies of the two sort of collections under one roof were complementary. So the Städel Art Institute focused on old masters, and the city art collection, the Städtische Galerie, actually focused on contemporary and modern art. And in 1933, you have sort of the first major disruption. Swacensky was fired from his position as a director at large. The works, like Beckmann, the museum had a huge Beckmann collection, actually biggest public Beckmann collection before 1945. These works had to be taken off the galleries, and the galleries had to be reinstalled. There are also a few instances of works that were actually taken aside so that you know, the Nazis could not take them when they visited the museum, looked at the inventories in 1937. And then we actually have several stages of basically confiscating the degenerate artworks. I mean, first for the exhibition in Munich, and then there was this other larger confiscation in then in the second phase. And then we also had works like our famous Dr. Gachet taken in December 1937. The sort of, so those were the three stages at the museum. And then, of course, in 1945, effort was made to retrieve some of the works. And today, there are about 6 works that the museum reacquired after the war that were formerly in the collection, acquired in the 1920s, and then taken in 1937 and then repurchased. Like Matisse, for instance.
All right. Thank you very much. Now we are moving on to our last participant on this panel, Sebastian Finsterwalder. He is a specialist for media and information services by training and has been working at the Central and Regional Library of Berlin, die Zentral- und Landesbibliothek Berlin, since 2006. He has been part of the library's Department for Provenance Research since its formation in 2010. Since 2021, he has been member of the board of the Arbeitskreis Provenienzforschung, which translates to Research Association for Provenance Research, and is the largest organization of professional provenance researchers today. His work in affiliated work groups is centered around provenance research in libraries. Since 2020, he has been part of the editorial team of Retour, which is a blog for provenance researchers. He is also a founding member of Tracing the Past, a non-profit organization dedicated to the research and memorialization of the persecuted in Europe between 1933 and 1945. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I will take the topic back to Nazi looting of books, and in this particular case, the dispersion of looted libraries in and around 1945 and well beyond that here in Berlin. The library of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, has already been mentioned today. The RSHA, as I will continue to call it, was a Nazi organization kind of on top of the SS and SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, and included an Amt Gegnerforschung, an office or a department on enemy research. And they had, among other things, one aim, to build a central library for the enemy research built from the libraries of the proclaimed enemies of National Socialism. So Jewish organizations and individuals, socialist and communist organizations, Catholic monasteries, and many other enemies, and especially Freemasons also, and Masonic libraries. This library was to be housed in or established in a confiscated building, a building of the Grand Lodge of Berlin, the Große Landesloge. This is a picture of the building at Eisenacher Straße in Berlin-Schöneberg. It was built around the turn of the century for the lodge, and it was a large building, 50,000 square meters. It had 8 temples, several banquet halls and conference rooms, a number of apartments for live-in staff and conference rooms, a museum, a library, an archive, offices. The building was confiscated in 1935, and then forth, after the aims of the RSH were put into place, used to store looted libraries from the entire Reich, of course, but also beyond the borders of Germany then, wherever books were looted. So books from France ended up there, from the Netherlands, from Austria, from Poland, and so on. The looting still exceeded the capabilities of this large building, which is why other spaces were needed. For example, another Masonic building at Emserstraße. The books collected here, as far as I can tell from what I have seen, were not marked or processed in a way that they would be in a normal library, meaning there are no stamps or numberings or shelf marks, especially for these libraries. It doesn't mean that this library wasn't working, because usually entire libraries were looted which already had functioning systems of shelf marks and already had catalogs that could just be used again. So you don't have to catalog an entire library. If you loot the entire library, you can just also take the system with you and just continue to use it. I will show an example of this later on. Before the end of the war, many books, when things got kind of sour for the Nazis, were relocated from this place, mainly to Silesia, where they then were, after the war, further dispersed, in part also by the trophy brigades. And part of this building was also destroyed in an air raid in 1943, where about 2/3 is estimated of the books still located at this place at the time burned. Still, many books survived and were in part collected after the end of World War II by the so-called Bergenstelle für wissenschaftliche Bibliotheken, the Salvage Office for Scientific Libraries. I have a couple of pictures that are possibly from this Bergenstelle. The pictures I'm showing here were found in my library in a photo collection with no traceable provenance and with no description, archival description whatsoever, that they are part of the Bergenstelle was assigned many years later. So it is possible, it looks like this. In the same collection, there is actually a picture of the building where the Bergenstelle was housed. You can see it here on the left. It's the so-called Ärmelhaus on Breite Straße. It in some way still exists because the facade was reassembled after the building was torn down, kind of around the corner on Fischerinsel. But it's not the same building, it's just the front is still there. Yeah. The Bergenstelle was an organization by the newly established Berlin magistrate after the end of the war in 1945. Until 1946, this Bergenstelle operated in Berlin and collected libraries. With the decree of the magistrate, they were able to collect libraries that were so-called ownerless, or had been part of Nazi organizations, or were libraries of NSDAP party members. This was especially the label party member of the NSDAP was used quite liberally, and sometimes not true, as it turns out later on. And I made a small map to see where this Bergenstelle operated in Berlin in the post-war period. As you can see here, it operated mostly in what later were the western sectors, and of course in Mitte, because there were a lot of libraries there. It's quite interesting how they worked. They collected libraries from larger libraries that were not working anymore, like, for example, the library of the Ministry of the Exterior. But they also just went into residential homes and collected the libraries from private individuals. Every salvage operation was documented in a file and was given a number. The documentation is kind of the same for example, the library of the Ministry of Air Transport, or if they went into a residential building and took one lexicon. It's basically 2 pages. Where did we pick up what, and when, and what did we do with the books? I've tried to highlight it here, number 15. You can see Bibliothek SS Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Berlin-Schöneberg, Eisenacher Straße 11 bis 13, 11 to 13. That's the building I showed you before. So the Salvage Office, the Bergenstelle, also collected books from the former enemy library. They did so until the Americans got to the library and stopped them. Still, they managed to take quite a number of books and disperse them. They dispersed them to mainly 3 libraries. One is the library we're sitting in here now, the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin. Another was the Ratsbibliothek of Berlin. The Ratsbibliothek was a municipal library of the Berlin magistrate, and at the time, directly after the war, it was located in the Ärmelhaus. On the picture here on the left, on the top, on the bottom right, it actually says Ratsbibliothek if you look closely. The third library was my library, the Berlin City Library, Berliner Stadtbibliothek. In our acquisition journals, we actually have documentation that books were delivered to us by the Bergenstelle, and in the acquisition journal themselves, after Bergenstelle, we sometimes do have little numbers corresponding with this list of the Bergungsauftragsnummern of the salvage operations. Interestingly, we also have these numbers in the books themselves. So in very quick hand, the corresponding number is written in the book, meaning that every time we find a book with the number 15 in them, written in this style, we know it was part of the enemy's library, and therefore probably looted. There were altogether 211 such salvage sites in and around Berlin. The files of the Bergstelle that I mentioned before were digitized by us and the Landesarchiv Berlin in 2011. They're online at bergenstelle.de. Yeah. As I mentioned, one of the main recipients was the Berliner Stadtbibliothek. The Berliner Stadtbibliothek, Berlin City Library, was kind of the central public library of East Berlin, and before that of Berlin. Since 1995, it has been joined with the public library of West Berlin that was established after the war to build the Zentral- und Landesbibliothek Berlin, where I'm working now, but I'm still basically working in this building in the Breite Straße. Breite Straße, you've heard this one before, was also the place where the Ermela House was. It's right across from the street there, where you can see the Trabis, and that was one of the main reasons why our library was one of the main recipients of the books from the Bergstelle. The other main recipient, Ratsbibliothek, was basically in-house, and the Ratsbibliothek in later years was joined with the Berliner Stadtbibliothek, meaning we actually have the lion's share of the books dispersed by the Bergstelle in our collection today. The library where I work at, the Zentral- und Landesbibliothek Berlin, has not been very forthcoming with provenance research until about the year 2001, when one of my colleagues, Detlef Bockenkamp, you can see him here, stumbled upon the Nazi-looted books in the collections and henceforth published on the subject, did his own research apart from his usual job, and made exhibitions and kind of pushed the library into pursuing this endeavor. It took him about 8 years until myself and other colleagues were installed in what is now the Provenance Research Department. And, well, we've been doing that ever since. Since 2016, we published our research in a cooperative database that is today has grown into a cooperation of libraries. At the moment, we are 15 German libraries, or the data of 15 German libraries and one Israeli library combined in this database. We also publish our research on our own website, of course. And I would like to, welcome you to browse this website for two main reasons. We publish information on so-called open cases, meaning we've basically done all the research, identified the previous owners of looted books, are sure that the books were looted, but have so far been unsuccessful in finding heirs or family members. But we also published the information on books we already were able to return, so others may join us in the future. One of our recent returns was part of the library of Erich Stern, which in 2023 we were able to return to Toulouse. These books were actually part of the library of the Reichsmain Security Office of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, and are one example of a collection that was left intact, at least in there. This is something that we can learn from documentation by Dr. Ernst Grumach. Ernst Grumach was a librarian, Jewish librarian, who was forced to work at the Reichsmain Security Office. He was able to read Hebrew and Yiddish, and was yeah, he was a first library there. He survived and gave extensive account of his work there, and was very helpful in identifying several libraries were housed in there. And as you can read here, he gives the account that in the so-called Irrgarten, among others, there were the library of the former professor at the University of Gießen, Dr. Erich Stern, and of the French author André Moreau, which were stored as a whole, so they were left together. One thing I almost forgot to mention, that the return of the books of Erich Stern was greatly helped by the CIVS, of the French ambassador, well, the French state. In the Cultural Asset Database, we try to connect all books of the RSHA Bibliothek, of the NMS library. So far there are over 800 of them, mainly in our library. And within this collection, you can see different patterns that lead you to further dispersions. One example is this book. It's a book that is not collected does not have a number 15 in them, an obscure stamp, and a stamp of the Institut für Außenpolitik und Auslandkunde, which was part of the DAWI, Deutsches Auslandswissenschaftliches Institut, which was another enemy research institution based in Berlin, but not connected to the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Apparently, they had some kind of exchange of books, or the DAWI did get books from the RSHA library, because we did find other books with the same obscure stamps. Sometimes you can read a couple of letters, so you can connect them, and we even found, through our cooperation, one of those books was found by our colleagues in Frankfurt, who received it from the Offenbach Archival Depot, where the Americans, after sending away the Bergenstelle from the RSHA library, brought the remainders of the books. And I think we will hear about this later today from my colleague Darlene Papelau. The obfuscation of these stamps was not always completed. The books I showed you are all part of the library of the Lutherheim in Königsberg, which was part of the Prussian University in Königsberg, the Albertus University. And this is one of the two open questions that I have, because in this case we really don't know what to do with these books. The university was entirely destroyed in the Battle of Königsberg. There is no legal successor, of course, of the Lutherheim or the university, but also in this case there is basically no functional successor. Still, these books are Nazi-looted books, and what to do with them at the moment. We, for now, document them online, try to document the history of them online as good as we can, and beyond that, they're still stored in our library. Another example of this is what we kind of dubbed the Chiffre library. We have a rather large collection of books, or now again collection of books in our library that are all from the Bergenstelle 15, so from the enemy's library. And apart from a combining shelf mark, they have no connecting provenance. Mostly they are not stamped. They have no ex libris or book plates, no dedications, mostly no names. Apart from, well, a couple of older provenances that are, well, accident. Not conclusive to the whole provenance of the chiffre library. We, for the moment, try to describe this provenance mark as detailed as possible. But what we really would need, and what I would like to see in the future, is some way of describing obscure provenance marks like shelf marks, like numbers, in a way that we can connect them better, that we can find them better. So if we, in this case, have a shelf mark starting with a G, then a couple of Arabic numbers, maybe sometimes a slash, sometimes not, and the number of a volume, this is kind of a system. But so far, we really don't have a unified way of identifying these systems in a way that we can connect our findings. I did bring a number of pictures, again from this chiffre library, always with the hope of someone recognizing these books. They're mainly 18th century books. Mainly in French, which I had always thought maybe it's a French library. It might still be, but then again, French is a kind of universal language, and the G might also be just the French section of this library. It must have been a very large library, just because we found so many books in our library, which usually was the recipient of not complete libraries anymore. So it's kind of still an open question. So if somebody knows this shelf mark, please let me know. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your research with us and demonstrating how hard it is to trace those books back to their original owner. And I think spreading the word about those provenance marks and shelf marks is a good thing too. Do we have any questions now? Yeah. Here's a first one and a second one.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian, for your great talk. It was great that you demonstrated with what we can actually gain, or what we started to work on with something like looted cultural assets. I mean, the next step would be using all those documentation to do pattern recognition. No, so that really, I think, would be a big step forward. But a question. Could you maybe share your thoughts on this really interesting point that you briefly mentioned, that we until now don't know any stamp of the Reichssecurity Main Office library? I mean, it is strange. No, we know of stamps of the Reichsinstitut, of the Forschungsabteilung, of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, and we know that this library of the Reichssecurity Main Office. I mean, they had, for example, more time, to process those big piles of books than the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. So it is a bit weird, and we do have some. You mentioned that there are other marks of cataloging that they could recycle from the rightful owners of the books, but they also, did have the time to put their own cataloging system into this Ergänzungsbibliothek, for example, the JA, JB, JC. But why is there no stamp? Could you share your thoughts on this question?
I don't know Occam's razor. It's just that there was no time. So I do not know why there wouldn't be a stamp. Not even one so far, because we did. It would make sense that they didn't get to stamp every book. It's not uncommon that not every library stamps every book. It's a time factor, because even though it's pum 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 pum, it still takes some time. But I don't know. Maybe there was a dispute over the design. I don't know.
your sharing your thoughts on this. I was just thinking, that maybe there's also some kind of symbolic aspect, to this question. Do you stamp another book that doesn't belong to you with your own stamp or not? No. But of course, it's all speculation. No, thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I won't be able to help you recognizing those books. But anyway, I have three hopefully short questions, and all of them historical. So about the Salvage Office. First, the definition of ownerless, that they used, I'm very interested in it. We are talking about very short period of time now until the American comes and stop them. But I mean, was there a definition? That would be my question, or was it like somehow in practice understood what is ownerless, what is not ownerless? And wait a sec, because it's connected to the second question, and maybe you could answer them together. You mentioned that they collected also libraries from the apartments of private people, like individuals. How did it look like? I mean, do we have sources that describe this kind of securement of the libraries, and what were the grounds? Are we talking about abandoned libraries? So if you could expand on that. And lastly, so I would be always interested in hearing more about the Jewish aspect of the things. Like in the Reich Main Security Office, we know that the libraries were collected separately. And then I am very curious if the Salvage Office, if they just took everything lumped together, or was the Jewish aspect of this abandoned books, this looted books, even erased, or they were just took what was there and that's it, and then dispersed it to other libraries. So yeah, that would be a question.
Regarding ownerless. Bin ich wieder da? Yep. Regarding the question regarding ownerless, in the decree of the Berlin magistrate, it's not defined. It's just herrenlos is the German expression. Basically, it's nobody's there, so that's it. The decree also was not focused on libraries, of course. In summer of 1945, it was a very widespread decree, and mainly focused on stuff like wood and coil and building materials. But there was this small section of people that were tasked. The task of the Bergenstelle was to acquire a lot of books that were either in danger of being destroyed because of the oncoming winter, and the aim of dispersing them again to functioning libraries again was, of course, kind of a Stunde Null rebuilding, Wiederaufbau thing. So showing it's there's libraries are open again, so it's all over and we can start anew. Regarding the private libraries, it's kind of topsy-turvy. You can kind of read it in the files. They kind of just came whenever they were called. That they kind of in a neighboring apartment, nobody was there anymore. The people in the building said, well, he was a Nazi, and then sometimes the Bergenstelle came and took the mainly worthless books away and brought them into the Breitestraße to disperse them again. There's no system behind the workings of the Bergenstelle. They kind of had a number of larger libraries, like the one of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, which were the smaller numbers, and then as it goes on, it's kind of chaotic. They only existed until officially they only existed until February 1946. In this time, they relocated more than 1 million books, and the head of the Bergenstelle continued working on a private basis after this time. But there are no files on this, so that's why it's hard to understand what exactly he was doing. what was the third question? The Jewish aspect. As far as I can tell, it was practiced to first take everything. The Reichsarchivhauptamt definitely did book exchange with other Nazi institutions, which we can tell by reappearing provenances, like I showed with the library from Königsberg. But beyond that, I don't know of any documentation of this. But I would say, from my experience, firstly, we take everything. Doesn't matter if we have the same book 5 or 6 times. It's basically easier to just do this one in the beginning and then shift through what you have.
Okay, thank you very much.